Well, I'd like to transition to our last speaker, last but not least, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Arjun Makhijani. Dr. Makhijani is the president of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. He holds a PhD in engineering with a specialization in nuclear fusion. He's extremely prolific in terms of his writings, and I always love assigning his writings in my class, and we're very honored to have him here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Makhijani, for being here.
You're welcome. I'm glad you assigned my stuff in your classes. Maybe I can come there in person. Oh. All right, so I'm going to give a talk in two parts very quickly and leave a lot to questions. I'm going to talk a little bit about radiation and health. Thank you for that. The Castle test series was possibly the most awful in 1954 in the Marshall Islands. It was probably the most awful, at least conducted by Western countries. I haven't studied the Soviet test series in as much detail. This is a map of fallout in the Pacific region. It's a little bit distorted because of what I did to paste it in, like that. Here's where the test took place. You can see this is cumulative fallout over a 3-month period up to July 1, 1954. And you can see this is about Mexico City. This is 245,000. Don't worry about the units. We're going to publish this map later on in formats that'll be easier to see. In the process of it right now, 52,000. You can see probably Los Angeles and the West Coast areas had more fallout from this test series than tests done in the Nevada test site. Because when tests were done in Nevada, they made sure to do the tests when the wind was blowing away from Los Angeles and Las Vegas. And in 1997, many of you may know, the National Cancer Institute, after much pressure, published a study on thyroid cancer because people were drinking milk that was contaminated with iodine-131 from fallout in the Nevada test site. And some of the most, so they estimated somewhere between 11,000 cancers, thyroid cancers alone, and more than 200,000 thyroid cancers. So it's very shocking, not surprising, normal, I would say, for some in the nuclear establishment to say, oh, your thyroid cancer is not due to fallout from Fukushima or whatever. But the US government study established that one of the big causes of thyroid cancer in that period, arising from that period, was because of fallout. So you can see thousands and thousands of miles away, hotspots, very, not so bad here, many times worse here. Here, this surprised me. The similar hotspot in Mexico City is around Sri Lanka and a sliver of the southeast coast of India, also thousands and thousands of miles away. So here's a chart on cancer. So I said I would say something about cancer risk. Here's a chart of cancer risk by age and sex. The pink line is females and the blue line is males. And you can see children are much, much more vulnerable. And this is 0 means the time of birth. Now, I don't have a graph for it because there's not a lot of actual research about the damage during pregnancy. Interesting that we don't actually have any particular regulations or rules to protect the embryo and the fetus, especially during the first 3 months. I can tell you some of the health damage that occurs, and I want to focus on that. I have in the slides, you have the slides. Eileen, you can post them. There are some resources, including my memo last month in January to the National Academies on this very issue. And the issue of impact on pregnant women in the first part of a pregnancy is very much ignored and should be attended to. What are some of the possible impacts and what are some of the established impacts? We know that environmental insults, toxic materials, and radiation can cause early failed pregnancies, like when the fertilized egg doesn't implant. Basically, a miscarriage very early on in the first few days or first couple of weeks. Most of such events are unrecorded because the woman doesn't realize that she is pregnant. And if you read the radiation reports, they will say, well, we can't tell you, it is a risk. They do acknowledge it's a risk, but it's not calculated because maybe a third of pregnancies, maybe 50% of fertilizations end before the woman might know that she's pregnant. I think it's Mother Nature's way of basically taking care of problems, and then human beings have added to that. So downstream from nuclear power plants, there's tritium emissions and discharges. There's radioactive rain, basically, around nuclear power plants, unregulated. Well, there are limits on total radiation, but the water of private wells of people living around the plant is not protected, exempt from drinking water regulations. To some extent reasonably, but exempt. The other thing that has been established actually from records of women who were pregnant during Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this is not a much known fact, is there were severe problems in the central nervous system, what is known technically as, or used to be known as, severe mental retardation, to the point that some children could not look after themselves, they could not speak. So extremely severe brain damage that occurred because of exposure between the 8th and the 25th week of pregnancy. And the most important thing, and this is acknowledged actually in a report, 1986 report of the International Commission on Radiological Protection, and you'll find the reference in my memorandum to the National Academies, is that there is no threshold to this risk. What does that mean? It means that if a pregnant woman is exposed to a small amount of radiation, there will be a small risk of severe central nervous system damage. More than proportionately more. For other risks like failed pregnancies and malformations of other organs, the official view is that there is a threshold. There's a limit below which there will be no damage. But I question this assumption because it does not take into account the kinds of damage that actually occur to the rapidly developing cells in the embryo and the fetus. I won't go on for a long time because I want to also give you a hopeful answer that we can do without nuclear energy. And I recently wrote 3 blogs, 2 on why we don't need nuclear and 1 on how we make a good energy system without it. I just want to show you 2 photos. This is Fukushima Daiichi on November 15, 2009, so a year and a half before the accident about. This is Fukushima Daiichi a week after the accident. This was a truly, truly shocking accident, even though, the idea that reactors could have these kind of explosions was known, but 3 in a single accident, this risk was considered to be so small that it could be ignored. But obviously it was not so small that it could not happen. And I do want to say something about the specific risks of cesium-137 and strontium. I mentioned tritium. There are all these classes of radionuclides: tritium, carbon-14, cesium-137, which is like potassium to the body, strontium 90, which is like calcium to the body, they all cross the placenta. And so they all affect the developing baby inside. And we have not, let me end by saying something about the question of radiation limits in Japan after Fukushima and what had been proposed about opening the schools. So I did a little calculation of what would happen if a parent agreed and sent their 5 or 6-year-old daughter to this school, not at the highest levels of exposure, but at the allowable middle level, allowable levels of exposure. And I calculated that over 2 or 3 years, there would be enough radiation, according to that chart I showed you, that the risk of this girl getting cancer would be increased by about 1%. Now you are the parent of this girl. About a third of all people will get cancer at some point in their life. Suppose this girl is one of that 1/3 that gets cancer. When you get cancer, you don't know, it's many years after exposure. So you don't know what actually caused it. This is one of the problems. Now you are the parent of this girl that got cancer and you sent this girl to the school. What would your situation be with yourself and to face your daughter? So no one would know. So by being protective, you're not saying it's a small risk, which is the view of the radiation establishment. You're saying I'm exposing my child to a preventable risk. And then the establishment is saying a lot of people will get cancer anyway, and it's a small risk relative to that. For me, it's an unacceptable risk. And I think for most parents, it would also be unacceptable. And I think this way of thinking that for some public reason that people should not only expose themselves, but subject their children to radiation, I found it quite unconscionable. So I've been studying for many years, can we do without nuclear power? So let me switch gears completely. So here's what today's energy system looks like. We're talking a lot about oil. It's an oil tanker. And then this is our control system for electricity, on-off switches. It's generally reliable in Western countries, more or less, electricity, but not as reliable as we would like. It's unaffordable for many, it's inflexible, and it's polluting. So on the right, you have a coal-fired plant, and on the left, you have a nuclear power plant. The famous cooling tower symbol are common to coal and nuclear. These are the cooling towers. These things are the reactors here. But I don't need to tell you that, you all know. Let me tell you about the inefficiency. So only about 1/3 of the energy in coal or the nuclear fuel actually reaches the home. 2/3 of it is discarded, mostly at the power plant in the form of waste heat. That's just how the physics of it works. This bulb, only 3% of the electricity is converted to visible light. This bulb, which we regard as extremely efficient, only 20%. So that's about as well as we can do. And 20% of electricity to light means about 6% of the fuel, the energy in the fuel, actually comes out as light. Cars, same thing. You go to war for oil, and then only 15% of the energy comes out as fuel. We have inexcusably inefficient energy. It's the same with homes. Very little actually is efficiently used. So I did a study for many years on Maryland, where I live. Can you have 100% essentially solar and wind energy system that's affordable and reliable? 2% hydro, which we already have relating to a dam in the state. So we need to change the grid. This is a $10 or $15 flash drive. All of the communication between consumers and producers today and the on-off switches can be put on a $15 flash drive. And the whole of the United States electricity system of $450 billion a year or above. This is a grid of the future in which consumers and producers talk to each other. Let me tell you a secret. Most people who say that you can't do it with solar and wind, and it would be very expensive compared to, say, keeping nuclear gas on, they set up a straw man in that they never assume a grid in which consumers and producers will talk to each other. Or the consuming device, really what will happen is the consuming device will talk to the producing device or the battery automatically. I'll leave you with one powerful number that will tell you that we don't need nuclear. We obviously need to go to electric vehicles in order to get rid of oil and run the transportation system on solar and wind energy. How much is the power of all the batteries? Suppose the vehicles were electric. So we can look at the horsepower of existing cars, more or less the same thing. Existing vehicles have about 25 to 30 times the capacity of the entire electric grid is in the cars that are standing on the roads and sitting in the garage 95% of the time. So you ask a different question. I did the calculation, and I'll stop there. Of the parking lot in the Baltimore, Thurgood Marshall, Baltimore, Washington International Airport, the long-term parking, so where people would leave their cars for a week or 2 weeks, has about 10,000 parking spots. If there were 10,000 parking spots filled with electric cars connected to the grid with the instruction, leave me enough charge to get home and then some, but you can manage my battery while I'm gone. And the grid will pay you for that agreement. The power of those 10,000 cars that the grid can manage and manipulate is about larger than a very big nuclear reactor. So, do we need nuclear reactors? No. Nuclear reactors are actually incompatible with high levels of solar and wind for technical reasons. I've written 3 blogs about this. You can read the technical details of it. Basically, I regard all of this hoopla about we need nuclear, including by some very good people, even some people I admire, like Secretary Chu at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, who was Secretary of Energy under Obama. He did a lot for solar energy, brilliant man. But I don't agree with him on this. There's a lot of conventional wisdom that we need nuclear because it's base load and 24/7. This is not sensible thinking. My final word to you is this thinking is based on the idea that you can stick a completely different type of electricity source, which is based on the rhythms of nature, obviously sun and wind. You can replace coal and nuclear and gas, which run with a switch. You can change that with wind and solar and do nothing else, basically. If you set it up that way, it's not going to work. You need to look at the whole production consumption system so that your technology at both ends works with the rhythms of nature. I did those calculations. You know, it shows you can get rid of 2/3 of the energy and have twice the level of economy. I modeled the hours in which demand was very high and wind was very low. Wind and solar was very low. Would it all still work? The answer was yes. And would it be affordable? The answer was yes. It would be cheaper actually than continuing business as usual. These are my resources. I'm sorry I had to rush through things, but I'd be happy to take questions about any of this. Thank you.